Hey everyone, thanks for joining me in today's video. My goal in this video is to make a knife and learn new techniques. So I'm going to be copying an existing knife. It's a Randall Model 14 Attack. And the reason I want to do so is to where I have something to actually compare the knife that I make to and kind of see the areas that I need to improve. And this was a knife that I had access to. It's a relatively simple knife with a full tang construction, black micarta handle with finger grooves, and a guard soldered on at 90 degrees. The blade itself is hollow ground and the top of the blade is sharpened as well, about 3 inches. I'll be using stainless for all the metal and I'm sticking with black micarta for the handle. Let's get started. I started the project out cutting the 1/4 inch 440C stainless down to its rough shape using an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel. Once it was roughed out, I took it to my woodworking drum sander, not the right tool for the job, but it did do it with a lot of passes, and surfaced the blade down to a 1/4 inch. I then used a template to scribe out the final profile of the knife. I did so by applying layout fluid and then scribing around a wooden template. So I used an angle grinder equipped with a standard grinding wheel to get close to this line, and then afterwards you'll see that I use a 2x72 belt grinder, and I believe I was using 60 and 80 grit belts just to really rough the blade out and get it to its shape, and then of course then you step up to higher grit belts later on. And throughout this video you'll see me use mostly standard tools that you can just go to Lowe's and buy. This is my 2x72 grinder, which I would say is the only really specialized equipment that I'm using in this video, and that I got at no cost. My dad ended up with this grinder and it was just in the back of one of his sheds, and when I started getting interested in knife making I grabbed it, bought some belts, and have been using it since. And it's certainly faster than the alternative of using all files, even though files are indispensable in the process of knife making. So that completes the profile of the blade. Next is to establish the grind lines. So I made a second little paper template that showed the limits of my grinds, and then I traced that out using the layout fluid again, and then used a set of dividers to mark out the center of the blade. So that's my goal, is to take that hollow grind right to that mark. The knife that I'm copying has a hollow grind, meaning that it is a concave shape. So the actual grind that establishes the cutting edge on the knife is curved inward towards the knife on both sides. And the same goes for the grind that'll be on the top of the blade. And this really was very, very tricky doing this for the first time. I'm doing it standing up. I have no table on my belt grinder. I'm doing it all just holding myself as steady as I can. I lock my elbows into my side and then moved as steady as possible. So I just showed the main grind on the knife, and then this is working out the top grind. For those of you who are looking to make some knives, you're going to find out that the most time-consuming portion is all the finishing work. I just started out using, I believe, 180 grit paper, and then just started removing all those grinding marks, backing up the paper with something stiff like a block of wood or micarta. You just kind of use whatever you need to get into whatever shapes. For example, there you see me using a dowel cut at a pretty acute angle. And right now all I'm trying to do is remove most of those grinder marks. I took the knife up to 600 grit paper and then sent all the blades I was working to Texas Knife Supply, and they did the heat treating and tempering of the blades and got them back to me in fairly quick order. I then took the knives back over to the belt grinder with a higher grit belt and cleaned off that scale. I mainly just used it to clean off the flats, and then I cleaned off the grinds completely by hand. I decided to use stainless instead of brass for the guard, as I wanted the whole knife to be as tough as possible and be kind of really resistant to any kind of corrosion. I used a piece of 303 stainless, 1/4 inch thick, 1 inch wide, and 12 inches long. I cleaned it up on the belt grinder, marked out where the tang of the knife would go through, and then drilled out the bulk of the material. Now if this was brass or nickel silver, I would have had a lot easier time cleaning out that hole to the rectangle shape needed, but it's stainless, so it's a little tricky. So I used my flex shaft tool to sort of cut off the little corners that are created by drilling, and then I got in there with various size files and then cleaned it up till I got that tang to fit in there. Then I just rough cut the guard to length. The final shaping on the guard I did on the belt sander, again using probably a 60 or 80 grit belt. And all I'm doing now is just trying to get the profile right. Any finishing will be done by hand on the faces, and then the edges will be cleaned up later once the handle is shaped. At this stage, I'm ready to solder the guard onto the knife itself, but I want to go ahead and do all of my finishing beforehand. So I'm taking the whole knife up to 600 grit at this time, and then I'll finish it off later with 800 grit once it's assembled. After I get it up to 600, I clean the whole knife off with acetone and then denatured alcohol to make sure the soldering process goes smoothly. I'm using a specific flux that works with stainless steel that I got from Texas Knife Supply at Stay Clean. And then also I'm using solder I got from them as well. And basically I think it is a very low melting temperature silver solder, and it really does melt at a fairly low temperature, and it's easy to shape afterwards. I used a propane torch to bring the knife up to heat, and I had a wet rag wrapped around the cutting edge to make sure I didn't get the blade too hot. For a handle, I'm using a piece of black micarta that I bought, and I'm cutting the 1/4 inch groove for the tang of the knife using a dado stack on my table saw. It's something you'll really want to be careful with since it's such a short piece of material, but it worked very good. It cut a nice clean line, and any kind of inaccuracy in the cut, as long as it's minor, will be filled with the epoxy once it's glued onto the handle. I then used a regular blade to trim it down to the width that I would need, but still leave enough to final shape the handle. I started the handle shaping process out at the bandsaw, where I kind of roughed out the shapes of the finger grooves and then finished them off on the spindle sander, and everything is still square at this point. After I shape the handle on the belt grinder, I'll go back to the spindle sander and make the handle more comfortable. The handle of this knife is epoxied onto the tang, so I drilled some holes through the tang after I annealed it with the torch. I annealed just the part that was going through the handle with a torch, and that makes it softer, and I was able to drill those holes, which will add a little extra bite for the epoxy. I'm using a West System 105 epoxy and the 207 clear hardener. That's a slower set hardener, and I mixed in some black powdered chalk just to darken it a little bit to where it would blend in with the black micarta handle. I applied the epoxy onto all surfaces that would be glued and then just slid it together, and it was a nice tight fit anyway between the handle and tang, but I ended up just slipping on some simple little spring clamps across the top of the handle. This nice design calls for a wrist thong to be on the back, so I needed to install a stainless steel tube. I did so by drilling a 1/4 inch hole, and that is the outside diameter of the tube itself. Then I cut that tube to where it would protrude from each side of the knife just a little bit, and it'll get ground flush when I shape the handle. Shaping the handle is done at the belt grinder, or you could use files or whatever else you have that can best shape something like micarta. It's going to shape a lot faster than the metal itself, so you have to be careful not to remove too much material. First, I just got these sides kind of ground down to the guards, and then I went ahead and removed the bulk of the micarta down to the back of the tang of the knife. Then from there, I started actually adding some of the curved shape, starting with the finger grooves, and then went to the back of the knife. And this is just to kind of get the corners rounded over, otherwise this is a fairly square-handled knife. To finish off the finger grooves, I rounded them over on the spindle sander, making sure that they all sort of rounded over to the same point along the length of the handle. I used my spindle sander and belt grinder up to 220 on the grit, and then from there I did all the finishing by hand. Again, up to 800 grit on the handle as well as the rest of the knife. I first polished up to 600 grit, oiled the handle, and then once it was dry came back and sanded it to 800 grit and then re-oiled it. Before I oiled the handle, I did a final cleanup using denatured alcohol, removing any dust from sanding the handle. Then I used teak oil, since that's an oil that will actually dry, to where I can oil it, and then once it's dry, come back and sand back into it with a higher grit and then re-oil. It's a similar thing I would do in woodworking, and it worked well on this micarta handle. This process created a very smooth handle. It was real comfortable in the hand, and it gave it sort of a nice satin sheen. This is after the first application of oil, but you'll see in some of the clips in the end of the video the final sheen on the handle itself, and again, I was very happy with it. And here's the end result. I'm very pleased with the way it came out. Got some different knife designs in the future that I'd like to make, and making this knife gave me some of the skills that will make making some of those designs much easier and the knife turn out much better than if I hadn't made this knife previously. Again, the reason I copied a Randall was because I had one in my possession, and it gave me a way to sort of make something and compare my knife to something that was made by an experienced person. It was a great way for me to go about learning, and I'm glad I did so and look forward to putting those skills to use in the future. If you're not a subscriber to my channel, click the subscribe button on the left, and I'll also have some videos planned on the right if you'd like to see some other videos that may relate to this video. You can also visit my website, thehomesteadcraftsman.com. You can leave questions below this video or email me at thehomesteadcraftsman@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in future videos.